I mentioned there's many light bulb moments. One is a nod to my mother-in-law, who I dedicated the book to, because around the same time after we moved, she was asking me questions. I think she was going in to have some surgery and had asked about, isn't there a form I need, so I can share my wishes? And then her second question was, how will you all know where I hid the pearls? So we have this running joke that, I wrote this book so I could find out where the pearls were.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. CPA Jody Giles is my guest today, discussing the Missing Pieces Plan and how to leave a legacy, not a mess. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care. The Heart of Hospice podcast is excited to announce our partnership with the Whole Care Network. The Whole Care Network is working to improve care and aging everywhere through education, resources, and storytelling. Check out the Whole Care Network for podcasts on caregiving, aging, and self-care. You can still find us at theheartofhospice.com and be sure to look for us on the Whole Care Network at thewholecarenetwork.com. My guest, Jody Giles. Love her. She's funny. I think we're soulmates, sort of joined at the Whataburger. So Jody Giles earned a master's in taxation from the University of Texas in Austin. She has attained both her CPA and CFP licenses. She has a passion for numbers, for planning, and for helping people. Even with her financial planning background, she was unaware of many missing pieces in her own financial plan, not to mention the plan for her loved ones. Even Jody, who's a planner, was missing pieces for her family and for herself. It wasn't until Jody and her husband moved across the United States with 2 4-year-old daughters that she stopped long enough to consider the what ifs. What if something were to happen to her and her husband? That move across country, along with inspiration from her mother-in-law and a good friend, motivated Jody to figure out what was missing and to create the Missing Pieces Plan. Now she's working to help others to fill in those missing pieces and to leave a lasting love letter to their loved ones. We had a wonderful discussion. She's got a lot of really good guidance, and it seems out of alignment for a CPA to be talking about end-of-life wishes. But it totally fits, because when we talk about advanced care planning, it's not just your money, it's not just your health care, it's not just your funeral planning, it's not just your will, it's not just your durable power of attorney. Advanced care planning includes all of that stuff. So estate planning and advanced care planning, it all blends together. It dovetails in there, and really, there's not a part of it that you should leave out. So you're going to hear more advice and guidance from Jody about that. So here's my conversation with Jody Giles, author of The Missing Pieces Plan. Jody, welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast. I'm so excited to get to talk with you today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So we're just going to give our listeners a chance to get to know you before we plunge into the work part of the podcast. So here's a question for you. If you could only eat one food, and we haven't scripted this out, Jody does not know what I'm asking. If you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Wow.
I can tell from your face you're putting a lot of thought into this. This is good.
I am. I would probably have to say Whataburger.
Oh, snap. Which is very meaningful.
Texas roots.
Yes,
for sure.
That's true. That's true.
Yes. I survived it as a child almost every day, so.
I think survive may be the right word.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
You identified with probably 75% of my listeners just by saying that.
Amazing.
That's a little bit of a cheat, because Whataburger, that's not a single food. That's the whole menu. So that's...
Well, true. I mean, I think of, the hamburger, the fry, and the milkshake, and the ketchup, of course.
And the breakfast burritos.
Yes, for
Yes.
sure.
Yes.
And maybe I should say to the listeners too, I'm now in California. So the closest Whataburger is, I think, a couple states over. So of course it is missed. Right. We have friends that get the mustard delivered to them. They live in Wyoming. And I asked, why not the ketchup? I'm fond of the ketchup. Probably could put sugar in it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Extra
Yeah,
sugar.
definitely. Definitely.
Okay. I feel like we need to stop this line of conversation before it goes any further south.
We'll get really hungry. Yes, but that was my home, what would you say? My home cooking. My mom really didn't cook, so I ate that a lot. And it was, my go-to.
Yeah. Let's face it, it's awesome.
It is. Definitely. Although those that are in California would probably disagree because In and Out, I think could be a feud there.
Mm-hmm.
But
In and
I
Out
will not
burger.
In and Out. It's just I was raised on Whataburger and just something about it.
Stay true. Stay true, Jody.
Right? Right?
All right. Now that we've had our goofing off time, let's start talking about our topic for today, which is legacy, estate planning, and the missing pieces plan. So you had what I would call a light bulb moment that was the catalyst for starting the missing pieces plan. Tell us about that experience, the thought that got it started, and the work of the missing pieces plan.
Sure. I would say, I think the light bulb moment, there were a few, but I think the biggest one was we had moved across country from California to Florida. And our twin daughters were 3.5 at the time. And I think upon arriving in this town, city where we knew no one, it occurred to me pretty quickly that if something were to happen to myself and my husband at the same time, what would we want for our daughters, Gigi and Ryan? And none of those plans were documented. I knew enough from my background in the field that it was really important to have guardians named. So we had done that piece. I think I just had an attorney friend draft up a 1-pager. However, that was still a California document. And I was still under, let's say, the impression, if you will, coming out of that space in financial services, that only a certain wealth holder, or you had to have a certain size estate to have what was called a quote unquote estate plan. So at that time, we didn't have wills or any of these documents that I write about in the missing pieces plan, and want the readers to know that no matter what your bank account size is, these pieces are invaluable. And I think no one wants to talk about it, of course, because it's end of life planning. So no one wants to, try that hat on. But the advisors are not talking to clients about it because, I hate to say it, but there's no fees involved in making sure that you have your will done or your advance directive. And, I've often found too, the clergy or people in our faith institutions, are expecting that the accountants or the financial services people or the attorneys are having the conversation with clients, and then vice versa. But really, no one's having a conversation and making sure that the plans are in place. So I think to close out this question, I think I just really visualized. It was my sister-in-law whom we had named as the guardian. And I visualized her, coming to our home if something tragic had happened to myself and my husband. And like, what would she do? Like, how would she know where our documents were or what we wanted for Gigi and Ryan, our funerals? What would she do until she could get there? She'd have to fly across country. So there was a lot of things I realized we really needed to have in place. And it was, for the benefit of our daughters, for their sake, to obviously lessen their suffering, but to have a plan for them.
It's interesting that your so-called light bulb moment, that realization that you had upended your entire family and put yourself in a place where there wasn't any plan if something, tragic were to happen. And yet you and your husband were both young people. The catalyst was, you made this cross-country move. But for a lot of people, especially older adults, it's a healthcare crisis that makes them think, I need some plans, because if this had not gone as well as it did, I don't have these things. I haven't had these conversations. I don't have anything documented. So I think that realization moment for you came much earlier than for a lot of people across the United States. Because we talk a good talk. A lot of us say we want to do certain things or we want to die at home. We just don't document it.
Right. Truly. Yeah. And I don't know. I think in talking about the book after it first came out, my mom had worked at MD Anderson Cancer Center, and I had volunteered there as soon as I was able. I think I was 13 was the minimum age. And we had a neighbor and I had a classmate, both of whom died of cancer. So I think I would tell the story. My mom really normalized death for me, I guess, if you could say that. And then my husband's father, we went through his journey with colon cancer and his death. And that was fairly, I guess it was probably 10 years or so once we moved, but it was a very impactful loss for all of us.
Did you incorporate some of the lessons that you learned and things that you'd seen with your father-in-law's illness and his death? Did you incorporate some of that into the book?
I think I did, for sure. And I think, the chapter that I wrote about that I knew the least going in, but knew it was just as important as the other chapters, was the healthcare directives. And I went and did a class at the local hospice and, really learned about the value of that communication, not only having figuring out what you want and having the courage to try it on and think about it and what would it mean, but also the value in talking to your family members about it beforehand. So they really know that these are your wishes. And I think the other important thing that I learned too is, often people will name their eldest son or feel like that, this was an example that I had heard, there's 3 children and a woman had named her eldest son just by right of order to be her healthcare directive. And then when they had the conversation about it, he was like, no, thank you. I prefer if Billy or whomever the second child was or third child to handle those decisions. But I think as it relates to my father-in-law, those discussions, I don't think took place.
So I want to touch back on something that you said that I think is maybe I don't want to say detail, but an aspect that people forget about or maybe don't consider when they're doing their advanced care planning. So you sort of rely on that role going to the oldest child or even going to your spouse. And you just sort of think, well, I don't need to designate anybody because this is who it'll go to and I'm happy with that. But if you haven't had that conversation and you accidentally, just by not naming anybody, you have designated somebody who's unwilling.
Right.
Says they don't want to do it or they find themselves incapable. They don't feel like they could manage it. What a huge mess that would leave.
Definitely. Yes. I think you're referring to, if you don't name someone by default, every state is different, but it may fall to your spouse, as you said, or a sibling. So just, the importance of, again, not only naming someone, but then having the conversation with them So they know what your wishes are, for one. So they really understand it, because when push comes to shove and they're in that moment, should they ever, have to be in that moment, they can feel confident that they're following your wishes, and that they feel like they can do that. The confidence and the strength, really.
Sure. And I think there's a flip side to that argument too, because you want to designate somebody, or even by default, designate somebody who is in agreement with what you want and will follow those wishes. I've heard of couples that sat down and the wife said, okay, I want this and this and this and this. And the husband says, well, there's no way I'm going to do that for you. I don't agree
Sure.
with that. I don't like it. I don't think I'd be comfortable. And in the moment, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be able to make that decision.
Sure.
Right, in compliance with what you're saying. And so the woman realized she needed to designate one of her children and talk to them and find someone who was actually, I wouldn't say approving of what your wishes are, but there have been situations where medical proxies don't make end-of-life decisions in alignment with who that person was or what they wanted. And that's not the way that directive's supposed to work. That's not the way that designated person's supposed to act.
Sure. And I think, just for me personally, I have named Jason, and, having children that are still under the age of 18, I just picture, if I didn't have that piece in place, imagining him agonizing over what to do.
Sure.
Which would be the last thing I would want. I would want him to be able to have all the strength and energy and wherewithal, to be there for our daughters.
Yeah.
And I've taken care of that, that decision. Or
it just complicates things so much. So one of the concepts that guides the missing pieces plan in your book is leave a legacy, not a mess. I absolutely love that. It's so concise, and I think it's really descriptive, because a legacy has meaning and purpose, and it creates memory that is important and valuable to people. A mess is just something that somebody else has got to clean up.
Very true. Yes.
What are some of the messes that you've seen people leave their families?
I think, and before I answer that too, I just want to say one thing that I tried to, describe in the book about, the word legacy, that can mean so many different things. And I feel like there's a notion that only a rich person should have a will, or a rich person can have a legacy or their name on the building. So I really wanted to drive home, like, legacy means so many things. It, passing down a recipe, or making sure family members have a story of yours that you want them to know. And I think, in regards to your end of life planning, those are the memories, unfortunately, at the end of your life, that you're right. If there's a mess, it's like, it really takes away from those left behind the ability, to grieve and process the loss when there are so many messes to take care of. One example, since writing the book, I lost my best friend, had a heart attack and died unexpectedly. And as much of a supporter that she was of my book, her adult children had a hard time finding her wishes. And so I watched, for over a week while they agonized how to plan her funeral, and what would she want, and what would her wishes. And they were, her son and now a daughter-in-law are both musicians. So it was just, almost agonizing for them to figure out the right music and what would be meaningful, and church and verses and speakers. And of course, it was beyond beautiful and such a celebration of her life. But I just hated that they had to go through that, versus, the gift in having written down instructions. And again, it's like little or as much as you want, but at least, if you leave a hymn that you like, or the person that you want to eulogize you, or a verse or a poem. I can't, my daughters laugh the way I say poem. So try to keep that in because that was amazing.
We will leave
Uh,
that in.
People are like, what word is that? But yes, I've just heard from so many people when wishes were left behind. It was like, I think I say this in the book. It was like one more I love you, or they really felt the presence of the person, in that celebration of life that they, had thought about those they were leaving behind.
It's like the wishes are an expression of that person's personality and who they were. Yeah, I love that. I love that. I think having a plan like that, when you take all these pieces that fit together well, you create an avenue for reminiscing as people are grieving. So it's not just, oh my gosh, we're having to choose music, but we're reminiscing, hey, mom chose this, Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen. And remember how much she liked this arrangement. It allows some meaning to enter into the grieving at the same time.
Definitely. In that example, I mean, can you imagine siblings fighting? Like, what if, there was fights over songs? And I'm
Sure.
sure whomever this person was that died, that's not the intention.
Yeah, you would hope that it
You would
wasn't.
hope.
And people, I
Yeah,
think in their grief, because people grieve so differently, it's easy to create conflict over any of those details.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
This episode is sponsored by Hospice Navigation Services, the guide for your journey. Navigating end-of-life care can be confusing and overwhelming. Hospice Navigation Services can help you navigate hospice care for the best end-of-life experience possible. Hospice navigators are hospice professionals with at least 10 years of hospice experience, trained to provide accurate, unbiased information. Our team's compassion and respect for quality of life allows them to help you focus on getting the kind of care you want. When you need in-depth information about hospice, a Level 1 navigation session can provide information on what hospice care includes, roles of the team members, and how to choose a hospice agency. A Level 2 session is the best choice if you want to include multiple members of your family or caregiving village, and includes an explanation of hospice costs and coverage. If you have specific questions about a current hospice experience, a question and answer session with a hospice navigator can give you the answers you need. Watch for the launch of the Hospice Navigation Services in the spring of 2023. Hospice Navigation Services, the guide for your journey. Now, back to the conversation.
In your book, you talk about the legal issues like having a will, a power of attorney, and an advance directive. And we know that all of those things are crucial. But you also include things like letters of instructions and even notes to loved ones.
Yes.
Which is part of, like an ethical will, it's part of your advanced care planning. Why are those items important? And what do you think ought to be included inside them?
I love that question. I think, I mentioned there's many light bulb moments, and one is a nod to my mother-in-law, who I dedicated the book to, because around the same time after we moved, she was asking me questions. I think she was going in to have some surgery and had asked about, isn't there a form I need, so I can share my wishes. And even at that time, I didn't even know what the form was called. And then her second question was, how will you all know where I hid the pearls? So we have this running joke that, I wrote this book so I could find out where the pearls were. But there are a number of different, letters and instructions that I think are so valuable to leave your loved ones. And again, no one is really talking to you about the importance of doing this. So like you said, a letter of instruction, I have a chapter in the book about that. And that's, again, that's the pearl reference. This is where you'd want to put your instructions for, jewelry or art or sentimental items. And, in doing my research for the book, I mean, that is where talk about fighting. That is, where people really have the most struggles. It's over the sentimental items,
Sure.
typically, not even maybe of any financial value. So that's such a gift to leave loved ones, and I mean, there's endless potential for what you could include if you a story about it, where a piece of jewelry came from, or why you want them to have it. And then the same goes true for letters to guardians, which I feel is so powerful. Naming a guardian is a huge thing, and I can't, say how important that is, but also including like how you would want your children raised, or what your values are, what's important to you, or, what kind of education you'd like them to have, any, I guess, instructions or, thoughts to share is, invaluable to both the guardian, but also so meaningful for children, especially if, they're of younger age.
There was a movie several years ago called Raising Helen, and I don't know if you remember it. Our listeners might know, but it was a group of 3 sisters, and one of them was killed along with her husband, leaving 3 children. And the younger sister, who was this, I go out and party, I'm single, I do the things, she was designated as the guardian. And the sister who died left letters to the other 2 sisters. And I'll never forget this, because the younger sister who received the kids, her letter only said song lyrics that made no sense.
Wow.
And it was the Whip It song from way back in the 80s. And what it came down to was she wanted her children to experience music and beauty and laughter and joy. And that's why she wanted the younger sister to have the guardianship of the children. But it was a very cryptic letter to leave.
Wow.
But it was really an ethical will of sorts. It was the letter to the guardian with the instructions.
Sure.
Just not exactly explicitly stated where she could understand it. But I can see how that would have so much value, especially for someone who is grieving and navigating through that loss. Not just the business piece of it, but the emotional piece of it.
Sure. Yes, you're right. The guardian is typically also grieving. They're probably someone that's really close to you, even a family member or a friend. So you're right. Really a good point.
When you talk about legacy issues, because these are the memories and the meaning that we create, planning an end-of-life celebration, a memorial service, a funeral, however you want to, home funeral, green burial, all of those things, what guidance would you offer about managing those legacy issues, especially around planning some sort of service?
In writing the missing pieces plan, I really didn't want to just write a book that said, here's what I think you need. Good luck. So the book is, half why I think these pieces are important, and the other half is worksheets. And I really wanted, people to utilize those, and recognize really the hardest thing is starting. Right. It's the heart. I mean, it's just the procrastination, but also it's something no one wants to do. It's thinking about us not being here. I mean, to try on not being here tomorrow, and, the grief of my daughters and having them, to live without me is unbearable. I guess you could say compartmentalizing, but knowing that if something should happen, and creating these plans is part of your legacy, and that they can take that with them and they know that you were thinking about them. So I think just starting that is just my first suggestion. And I usually tell people, just get a notebook, whatever you journal in, whatever it is, grab a pen, set a timer. I mean, it can be for 5 minutes, but just sit and think for a minute. What would be the most important thing to you about planning your funeral? Would it be the location? Would it be, who's speaking, flowers? I had a high school friend whose father-in-law wanted everybody to wear golf shirts. I mean, there's a full gamut. Like I've asked for whoopee cushions in the seats because I was like, I think I got that idea after Nancy Lynn is the name of my friend. And I remember walking into the church, and seeing all the little Kleenex packages in the pews, and it just pissed me off. It's like, ugh. I think I was going through whatever stage
Sure.
of grief that was at that time. So I was like, screw that. I hope I can
Absolutely.
say that on a podcast. And yay. And I was like, I want whoopee cushions. This sucks, basically, is how I was feeling at that time. So So back to the instructions. I mean, 5 minutes really. And a lot of times, if you are in a church setting or wherever you celebrate or get spiritual or at the beach, that's where I typically am like, I really like that song. Let's add that. Or, you know, thoughts come to mind. It's really just taking a snippet of time, really, to do all the pieces. That's what I say.
I really love the idea of selecting a place. It doesn't have to be a traditional building, doesn't even have to be inside a building for that matter at all. So,
Right.
recently I've been working on my advanced care planning. And I have 2 adult kids. They're awesome. They each responded to my conversations about my end of life with
Right.
what I expected them to do, how I expected them to respond, which was, one of them's like, I will pull the plug this afternoon if you need me to. And the other one was pretty much, I don't think you're ever going to die, so I don't want to talk about this with you. Of course, according
Of
to their
course.
personalities. But my husband, I think I've told this story on the podcast before. My husband is a really quiet guy, does not work in healthcare, and I think he tolerates my discussion about death and dying all the time
Sure.
with just a lot of patience.
Yes.
And so for me, every time we go to a funeral or we hear about somebody dying, it's a catalyst for me to look at the funeral or the service we've been to, and I think, I don't want that. I thought this was meaningful, So I'll tell my husband, he gets trapped in the car with me on the way home. And I tell him, and I said, well,
Sure.
what do you think
Yes.
about yours? And he's such a quiet guy. So he has told me he's left one instruction, and that is we are to sing Amazing Grace to the tune of Gilligan's Island.
Amazing.
Yes, which I'm pretty sure we could go to hell for that because I tried it and it's just sounds sacrilegious. It's awful.
I love that so much.
I'm hoping that he's kidding, but I think he was serious.
It sounds like, if he sounds like a pretty serious guy, I mean, again, just one thing. And think about you all sitting in the pews or the chairs or where in the grass, wherever you are, his presence will be there. That's for sure.
He'll probably think that's hilarious from wherever he is.
Exactly.
Isn't that a legacy to leave right there?
I
love it.
definitely. Yes, definitely. I think, well, I don't know if I had already finished the book or was still working on it. And I just randomly came across this young lady, and I can't remember how we started talking. She couldn't have been 20. And she said her father had passed away, and he had said he didn't want anything. And she said how hard that was for her, because it didn't allow her the grieving process that comes with having, some sort of celebration of life.
Yes.
So I think that's something important to consider. It's not for us. It's for those that are left behind.
That's a lesson that I learned while I was working on my advanced care planning, because what I realized was I kept going back to my kids and saying, would this have meaning for you? Would this be important to you to include? Would this bring you comfort? And for me, what I realized about planning a service is my service should be not so much about my taste, because they know who I am, how I live my life and what I enjoyed, but would it be meaningful for them at that point after my death?
Sure.
And I think we forget to talk about that sometimes. A lot of times we talk about the person who's deceased, who's going to die, make it all about the stuff that you liked, is it an expression of you? But for me personally, I would prefer that it had meaning and comforted my kids somehow.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think I have written in, depending on the age of my children, when I first started doing this work, they were 3.5. And we have since moved back from Florida to the West Coast. And, you know, it'll depend on where we are in the country, but I feel like also their age and, you know, who they would want to be there. And I think as far as being cremated or buried, I've also thought that that's probably pretty age dependent for them as well. So I've left that, you know, open for Jason to decide for the girls, you know, what would they feel comfortable with, I guess. That my preference there is really for them. And I guess that's okay. I don't know if I've ever actually talked to in depth about that, but I feel like that's important too.
I think so, considering the age. And of course, the methods of disposition of a body,
Right.
those are changing. Green burials are a thing. Yes. So there are options that we didn't have 20 years ago.
For sure.
I remember years ago when I first started in hospice talking to my girls about wanting to be cremated, and they were both horrified.
Right. Right.
Horrified.
Right.
What do you mean? You know, we want to prop
Right.
you up in the living room forever and ever so we can talk
Sure.
to you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, those dynamics and the maturity level of your kids and who they are, that changes. It's just
Definitely.
another good reason to go back and revisit your advanced care planning.
Exactly. Yes. Great plug. Just tell people tax time, we're already doing something that we don't like to do. It's a great time. Just get out the notebook and review everything.
Absolutely. Nothing is sure but death and taxes.
Right.
So that's the best time to do it. Okay.
Yes.
So, Jody, I have one final question for you. If you could
Okay.
only offer 3 pieces of advice about estate and end of life planning, what advice would you offer to my listeners?
I'm going to cheat because I may have more than 3 pieces. I think my first, for sure, is if you have children under the age of 18 at home or even 22 in college age, life insurance. I'm really a proponent and feel like having even just a term policy is the greatest gift. And for both parents, it's so key. I think in my work experience and career up until the point of writing the book, it was very much only the man, the husband, in years past, a lot of times, mostly the breadwinner would have it. But when you think about, if I'm not here, they say, what the mom, her role not only isn't invaluable, but I think it equates to, the carpooling, the cooking, and then for, the other spouse to not work. So how do you make up for that income and that caretaking? So that is definitely one thing that I recommend. And then as far as like the estate planning and more legal documents, I mean, just having a will, having your wishes, and with that, it typically comes, a whole package. So here's where I'm cheating. So typically when you do this quote unquote estate planning, you're going to do your will. And depending on what state you're in, it usually may also have a trust associated with it. And then a lot of times when you're doing that, you're also doing your power of attorney for like your financial items. And that's the person that you want to make those financial decisions for you should you become incapacitated. And then there's also the advanced health care directives that we've been talking about today. And I tell people, this is a plug that I do not get paid for, but just to get started, there is a great site, freewill.com, just walks you through it. And I just really recommend people going through the exercise. And should you want, it's a plan that would suffice, I think, in most states, but you can then take that to an attorney, but you've at least started.
Sure.
And then, of course, your funeral. Can that be number 3?
That hits on the big ones, I think.
Right.
So, Jody, how can listeners connect with you and order their copy of the Missing Pieces plan?
The Missing Pieces plan is on Amazon, and there's a link from my website, jodygiles.com.
jodygiles.com. So I'll have a link in my show notes so that listeners can go straight, order the book. Awesome, awesome book to have. Jody, thank you so much for taking time with me. I love your connection to Texas. Come back and visit us and get yourself some Whataburger anytime.
Most definitely. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's important work, so thank you.
So I think Jody had a leg up on most people. Most of us come to the realization that, advanced care planning, creating a will, creating an estate plan, creating guardianship documents for our kids, we don't get to that until there's a health crisis or later in life if we're lucky. We don't even think about it till we're older. But she was given a little wake-up call without anything horrendous having to happen. She just made a move and then all of a sudden realized there's no safety net. How smart was she to figure that out and act on it? She does stress the importance of documenting your wishes. Not just the wishes for your finances, leaving a trust, that sort of thing, but wishes like for sentimental objects, personal objects, and how that really works to give peace to the family. I really love the idea of letters of instruction and notes, writing notes to your loved ones to help pass along your values and your love. And what did she say were the pearls? Tell you where the pearls are hidden. So you're going to want to check out the Missing Pieces Plan book. She's got instructions in there. She's also got worksheets. And remember, if it seems like a daunting task, and it probably will at the very beginning, remember Jody's suggestion? Just start. Just pick up a pen, pick up a pencil, and give it 5 minutes. 5 minutes of your time just to get yourself going and create some momentum. She also recommends freewill.com. And remember, we're going to have that in the show notes. You can go straight to it when you need to. You can find the Missing Pieces Plan book on Amazon. And then check out Jody's website at missingpiecesplan.com. Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram, and send me your questions or comments by email to helen@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the Heart of Hospice.